Hello and welcome to the Origins of Islam. Today we want to start into a new series which I'm calling Changing the Quran. This will be all about analyzing original texts and how we can know that they've been changed. But before we can get to that point, we really have to take several steps back. And today we want to start with the first video, which is called The Sira as Context for the Quran. And here we are looking at how the biography of Muhammad was created in order to provide a context for the Quran after the original context was lost. And the original context was, of course, Christian scriptures and Apocrypha, something that we've looked at in the past. Let us therefore recapitulate real quick. Read by itself without external context, the Quran cannot be understood. Large parts of it simply don't make any sense. The original context was the Bible, as well as Jewish and Christian Apocrypha. As the religion of the Arabs evolved from an anti-Trinitarian form of Christianity to Islam, a new context was needed. With the evolution from Muhammad I, Jesus, to Muhammad II, the Prophet of Islam, a canvas was created upon which the new context could be projected. The life of Muhammad became the new context. Entire narratives have been created to make sense of dark or obscure passages. For example, Surah 9:100 talks about emigrants and helpers who are guaranteed paradise. Without context, this passage doesn't make any sense. Why emigrants and who are the helpers? As it turns out, this is another misreading. Robert Kerr has shown that Muhajirin and Ansar do not translate to emigrants and helpers, but to Arabs and Christians. But be that as it may, the fact of the matter is that the Arabs ended up with this misunderstood passage, which didn't make any sense. So they constructed a new context based on the Prophet Muhammad, which is in fact the Hijra. So in this new context, Muhajirin and Ansar do not refer to Arabs and Christians anymore. Instead, they refer to the emigrants and helpers of the Hijra, of Muhammad's flight from Mecca to Medina. This is of course just one example. The Quran is full of these examples, and that's what we want to look at today. Traditionally, historians have always assumed the biography of Muhammad to be basically correct. They just cross out everything supernatural. But even that's not always straightforward. For example, while it's easy to imagine that Muhammad only dreamt about his ascent into heaven, what do you do with the Battle of Badr? If you want to get rid of the supernatural parts, now you have to rewrite the story. Either turn it into a major battle or into a tiny skirmish. It certainly doesn't work the way it's described in the Islamic tradition. Now, this kind of approach is not something that historians would accept for any other field of research. For example, no historian would say that the story of Hercules is basically correct minus all supernatural events. And the same is true for many other ancient characters, like Theseus, the legendary king of Athens, like Kyrgyz, the lawgiver of Sparta, Jason and the Argonauts, Romulus, the founder of Rome, and many more. Historians agree that either none of these characters existed at all, or if they did, that virtually nothing related to their lives in the legends should be believed. And it's not just these ancient characters. Also medieval characters like King Arthur or Hildebrand fall under this category. On the picture on the right of the screen, you can see an illustrated page from a manuscript about the legend of Hildebrand, who was a famous Germanic hero of the early Middle Ages. So if we apply the same skepticism to the biography of Muhammad, we can try to reverse engineer the creation process. What is striking is the fact that virtually every piece of Muhammad's life, as it is told in the Sunnah and the Sira, gives context to one or more verses in the Quran. Therefore, we can formulate the following hypothesis. The life of Muhammad was constructed to provide a new context for the Quran after the original context, the Bible and the Apocrypha, were no longer understood as such. One thing to keep in mind is that this doesn't necessarily mean that we are looking at a deliberate fraud. What we are likely looking at are scholars who did not know the story of how the Quran was proclaimed and written down, but who were wondering how this came to be. The more wonderings were put to parchment, the more plausible it all looked. In this case, it would be perfectly circular to explain the Quran according to the Prophet's biography. Rather, we'd have to explain the biography with the Quran. So the question is, can we test this hypothesis? And the answer is, to a degree we can. As we all know, there are many different readings of the Quran. Here we want to compare two of them, Hafs and Nafi. And we want to look at Surah 2, verse 119. In the Hafs version, this verse is understood to mean, and you will not be asked about those in hell. Now, the scholars following this reading explain that it was revealed when Muhammad grew distraught about the refusal of Jews to believe in him. God revealed this passage so that Muhammad would not feel responsible for their disbelief and subsequent condemnation to hell. Now let's look at the Nafi version. And the difference is really only a very, very small change, only one little tick that is different. This small difference, this little tick, means that now the sentence is understood as "and do not ask about those in hell." This does of course also mean that the story explaining the Hafs reading doesn't fit anymore. After all, the Jews who don't believe in Muhammad are alive and not in hell. So how can we square the circle? Well, the answer is simple. The scholars who follow the Nafi reading insist that God revealed this verse when Muhammad was worried about the eternal fate of his parents, who had died before he preached Islam. So what we see is two completely different stories about the revelation of this passage, which is in line with the respective reading thereof. It's almost as if the story of Muhammad was tailored to the reading of the Quran and not the other way around. Let's look at another example. The same phenomenon can be found with the stories meant to explain a phrase found in Surah 288. Our hearts are sealed. Or, according to another way of reading the same phrase, our hearts are containers. Those Muslim scholars who follow the first reading explain that one day the Jews of Medina, exasperated by the Prophet's preaching, told him, "Our hearts are sealed. That is, we will not listen to what you say." Those who follow the second reading explain that one day the Jews of Medina, wanting to flaunt their religious knowledge, told Muhammad, "Our hearts are containers," as in containers of the wisdom found in the Torah. These cases suggest that many stories in the Prophet's biography are not memories of historical events, but rather stories told to explain material in the Quran. The manner in which stories about Muhammad seem to build from material found in the Quran seems fundamentally similar to the manner in which early Islamic sources tell stories about other prophets. Let us look at Surah 230, for example. Talking about Adam, it says, "Indeed, I am sending on the earth a Khalifa." Khalifa can mean either viceroy or successor. Most scholars reject the first option. That would be in conflict with the traditional Islamic understanding of God as wholly unlike humanity. He cannot have a viceroy, which leaves the second option. But now these scholars need to explain how Adam, who is the first human after all, could be a successor to anyone. Al-Tabari writes, "The first to inhabit the earth were the jinn. They spread corruption thereon and shed blood and killed each other. So God sent Iblis, the devil, against them with an army of angels, and Iblis and those with him killed them, pursuing them as far as the islands of the oceans and the summits of the mountains. He then created Adam and settled him thereon. That is why he has said, 'I am about to place a Khalifa on earth.'" This story neatly explains why the Quran calls Adam Khalifa. But obviously the story is legendary in character. There wouldn't have been any witnesses who could have remembered or written down these events. Such stories are so common in early Muslim commentaries that it seems likely that the earliest stage of Islamic exegesis involved above all the telling of stories meant to explain passages within the Quran. One way in which historians try to establish that a story about the Prophet Muhammad is indeed true is by using the criterion of embarrassment. The criterion of embarrassment is a type of critical analysis in which an account is likely to be true, as the author would have no reason to invent an account which might embarrass them. So for example, in biblical scholarship, this criterion has been used to argue that Jesus was really baptized by John the Baptist and that Jesus was really crucified, because if one were to invent a Messiah figure, one wouldn't have included these details which go against the Jewish expectations of the time. Similarly, it has been argued that the episode of Muhammad reciting the infamous satanic verses is a case where the criterion of embarrassment applies. In Surah 53, verses 19 to 20, it says, "Have you considered Elat and El-Uzza and Manat the third the other? These were the pagan goddesses of the Arabs, the daughters of Allah." The associated story is that Satan put these words into Muhammad's mouth. Some historians argue that if one were to invent a prophet, one wouldn't invent a story wherein Satan put words into the mouth of that prophet. That would be embarrassing. However, when we look at the commentaries on Surah 53, for example in Tabari, then we do not find the story about Satan whispering a false revelation to Muhammad's ear. Instead, this story is mentioned in relation to Surah 22, verse 52, where it says, "And we did not send before you any messenger or prophet, except that when he spoke, Satan cast into it some misunderstanding." Therefore, we can see that it was of vital importance for Muhammad to utter satanic verses. Otherwise, he could not have been a prophet according to this reading of the Quran. Once again, we're looking at an episode in Muhammad's life that was likely constructed much later. It really wasn't embarrassing at all that Muhammad uttered satanic verses. Rather, it was necessary. And with that, we're at the end for today. In the next video, we will see how this constructed biography of Muhammad itself later then had an influence on the Quran. Until then, thank you very much for watching and see you next time.